Varied implementations and modifications. The Peace Officer Bill of Rights has not followed a single, uniform template across the United States. Instead, it has undergone localized modifications and reinterpretations, resulting in a heterogeneous legal tapestry that reflects the political climates, collective bargaining environments, and historical legacies of different states. Some jurisdictions have adopted comprehensive statutes closely modeled on Maryland's pioneering law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights, while others have integrated POBR-style protections piecemeal into administrative codes or collective bargaining agreements. Understanding how POBR has taken shape state by state is crucial to appreciating the full breadth of its impact, as local iterations reveal both the adaptability and the controversy embedded within these reforms. Maryland, the foundational model. Maryland's LEOBR, enacted in 1974, laid the cornerstone for subsequent POBR legislation. Its key provisions established mandated timelines for investigations, guaranteed rights to representation, and restricted the admissibility of certain types of evidence in disciplinary hearings. Over time, Maryland's statute has undergone amendments prompted by public criticism and political debate, yet it remains a touchstone for understanding the original intent behind POBR protections. Although Maryland's model has inspired other states, each jurisdiction has made conscious decisions to retain, refine, or discard particular elements, demonstrating that the statutory scheme can be repurposed to reflect local priorities. California, expansive protections and high-profile debates. California's Public Safety Officers Procedural Bill of Rights Act emerged in 1976 and stands as one of the most robust and well-known frameworks in the country. It codifies detailed procedures for investigations and interrogations, strictly limits the use of punitive measures without due process, and grants officers the right to inspect and respond to material in their personnel files. Over the decades, California's approach has sparked heated debate. Advocates argue that these provisions have set a high standard for procedural fairness. However, critics assert that the complexity of the statute makes it difficult to hold officers accountable, particularly when misconduct allegations involve excessive force or other serious infractions. As a result, calls for reform frequently target not only the scope of protections but also transparency measures, with proposals aimed at expanding public access to disciplinary records while preserving core due process guarantees. Florida and Illinois, nuanced adaptations. Florida's law enforcement officers benefit from a Bill of Rights that, while echoing the procedural safeguards found in Maryland and California, includes unique elements tailored to the state's particular political and labor landscape. Among its provisions are firm guidelines governing when and how officers can be interrogated, stipulations about informing officers of their rights before questioning, and mandatory notifications if the officer is considered a subject of an investigation. While this structure has reassured many officers who fear arbitrary discipline, it has drawn criticism from civil rights advocates who argue that the system can be used to delay disclosure of critical information or undermine meaningful oversight. Illinois has also implemented a modified version of POBR principles through state legislation and collective bargaining agreements. Here, the influence of powerful unions and a history of contentious labor negotiations have led to provisions that emphasize the appeals process and arbitration, enabling officers to challenge disciplinary actions before neutral third parties. Though these mechanisms were created to guard against unfair treatment, they can, in practice, prolong investigations, add administrative burdens, and sometimes result in the reinstatement of officers previously dismissed for cause. New York and New Jersey. Layers of complexity. In states like New York and New Jersey, POBR-style rights often arise from a combination of state statutes, municipal codes, and binding arbitration clauses negotiated in collective bargaining agreements, rather than a single unified law. New York, historically governed by the Taylor Law and a tradition of strong public sector unions, has seen police departments and unions incorporate rights akin to POBR into their contracts. Although the state does not have a singular POBR statute, officers frequently enjoy procedural protections similar to those codified elsewhere, including limits on interrogation tactics and rigorous disciplinary procedures. However, these contractual safeguards can vary widely from one jurisdiction to another, reflecting the power dynamics at the bargaining table. In New Jersey, police disciplinary frameworks may be supplemented by administrative regulations and civil service rules that function in tandem with negotiated agreements, thereby creating multi-layered protections that are difficult for reformers to disentangle. Rhode Island and Louisiana, stringent procedural requirements. Rhode Island's Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights is among the most stringent in the nation, reputed for creating substantial barriers to swift discipline. It includes detailed guidelines for complaint filing, demands for formal hearings before discipline can be imposed, and intricate appeal procedures. Critics argue that these provisions hamper accountability by injecting procedural rigidity into every stage of an investigation, thereby discouraging thorough scrutiny of misconduct claims. Louisiana's model similarly incorporates strict rules governing interrogation and discipline, often interpreted in conjunction with civil service regulations that afford police officers multiple layers of protective review. This combination can prolong the disciplinary process, resulting in criticism from municipal leaders and community advocates who contend that the state's intricate legal framework prioritizes officer protections over timely accountability. Emerging trends and recent reforms. In recent years, some states have considered reassessing or even repealing aspects of their POBR legislation. Heightened public concern over police misconduct, amplified by media coverage of high-profile incidents, has led legislators to question whether the existing legal frameworks remain fit for purpose. For instance, following public protests and calls for reform, states that had historically adhered closely to POBR models began contemplating modifications aimed at increasing transparency. Proposals include reducing the waiting periods before investigators can interview officers, broadening access to disciplinary records, and allowing for swifter suspensions or terminations in cases of egregious misconduct. Maryland, in particular, has revisited its original LEOBR. After decades of serving as a template for other states, Maryland lawmakers, responding to public pressure, enacted significant changes to their policing statutes in recent years. Although not a wholesale abandonment of POBR principles, these reforms illustrate how shifting social and political attitudes can prompt legislatures to recalibrate the delicate balance between procedural safeguards for officers and demands for public accountability. Local variations and municipal initiatives. Within states, further variations emerge at the municipal level. Some large cities have negotiated memoranda of understanding, collective bargaining agreements, or departmental policies that replicate or exceed POBR protections, effectively creating micro-POBR regimes. In other locales, mayors and police chiefs have sought greater latitude in disciplining officers by proposing contract amendments or supporting state-level reform efforts. As a result, analyzing POBR's impact requires understanding not only the controlling state statute, but also the interplay of administrative codes, city charters, and negotiated agreements that can reinforce or attenuate these protections. Comparative implications and lessons learned. The diversity in state-level implementations and modifications to POBR underscores the statute's flexibility and, from another viewpoint, its vulnerability to local political and labor dynamics. In some jurisdictions, police unions have leveraged collective bargaining to insert POBR-like protections where none previously existed. In others, reform-minded legislators have attempted to roll back or recalibrate specific provisions to address criticisms of secrecy and obstruction. Observing these state-by-state differences provides insight into how certain factors, union strength, political leadership, public awareness, and judicial interpretation, intersect to shape the fate of POBR legislation. For instance, states with strong union traditions often feature robust protections that can be difficult to reform. Conversely, those with a more fluid political environment or well-organized advocacy coalitions may find it easier to enact incremental changes. The interplay between statutes and labor contracts is especially illuminating. Where POBR provisions are enshrined in both law and contract, reform efforts must navigate not only legislative processes, but also potentially protracted labor negotiations and arbitration. Looking ahead, Potential pathways for harmonization. The state-by-state patchwork of POBR laws highlights the challenge of standardizing accountability measures across the nation. Policymakers, advocates, and legal analysts have suggested that future efforts might focus on identifying best practices drawn from states that have successfully balanced officer protections with public oversight. States that have introduced modest transparency measures, streamlined disciplinary timelines, or provided for independent oversight boards may serve as models for others considering reforms. This horizontal exchange of ideas between states, facilitated by policy think tanks, academic research, and advocacy networks, could gradually reshape the landscape of POBR implementation. As public scrutiny of policing intensifies and demands for justice and transparency grow, states that once considered their POBR statutes untouchable may find themselves reassessing foundational assumptions. Incremental changes, such as modestly adjusting interview waiting periods or expanding what constitutes a serious violation that merits expedited discipline, could serve as testing grounds for broader overhauls. Over time, a more balanced and nuanced set of POBR-inspired protections might emerge, one that recognizes the importance of due process for officers, but does not unduly hinder the essential goals of accountability and public trust. In sum, the varied implementations and modifications of POBR legislation across different states illustrate both the adaptability and inherent tensions of these laws. While some states have embraced extensive protections that make discipline a drawn-out affair, others have begun reassessing their frameworks to ensure that justice and fairness are achievable from both the officers' and the community's perspective. This ongoing evolution, informed by empirical research, political advocacy, and robust public discourse, will continue to define how POBR statutes shape American policing in the decades to come. Comparative outcomes and trends. State-by-state variations in the implementation of the Peace Officer Bill of Rights have led to discernible differences in outcomes and discernible trends that reflect both the adaptability and structural complexities of these frameworks. While many of these statutes share core procedural protections, their distinct legal nuances and enforcement mechanisms have produced divergent effects on transparency, disciplinary consistency, public trust, and the overall functioning of internal accountability systems. Examining these comparative outcomes and emerging patterns not only provides insight into the efficacy of POBR legislation, but also illuminates the policy choices available to legislators, police departments, and community advocates seeking to recalibrate the balance between officer protections and public oversight. One of the most striking comparative trends involves the degree to which POBR provisions influence the transparency of disciplinary processes and public access to information. In California, the Public Safety Officers Procedural Bill of Rights Act historically restricted the disclosure of officer personnel files and disciplinary records. This approach, often defended as essential to preserving officers' privacy and due process, has sparked criticism that a relative lack of transparency undermines public trust and hampers accountability efforts. Over time, mounting pressure from civil society led to legislative reforms, such as California Senate Bill 1421, which partially opened disciplinary records to public view. These incremental changes reflect a trend toward greater transparency, suggesting that even states once committed to stringent confidentiality measures may adapt as public sentiment and legislative priorities shift. In contrast, states like Rhode Island have preserved stringent procedural requirements that can slow down or complicate disciplinary actions. The state's Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights historically required formal hearings for discipline and imposed rigid timelines for investigations. The result has often been protracted proceedings and, in some cases, limited public access to the underlying details. Over time, this environment has contributed to outcomes in which serious allegations linger amid drawn-out reviews, diminishing public confidence in the prompt and effective resolution of misconduct claims. These differences underscore a key trend. While some states, like California, have begun to loosen long-standing confidentiality provisions, others maintain their protective frameworks, potentially yielding uneven public perceptions of accountability. A related set of comparative outcomes involves the influence of POBR on disciplinary consistency and the predictability of sanctions. In states where independent review boards and arbitration clauses are integral to POBR frameworks, such as Illinois and parts of New York, disciplinary outcomes can be less uniform. The reliance on arbitrators, who may reinstate officers even after departments have imposed significant sanctions, can yield an impression of inconsistency and fragility in the accountability process. This pattern stands in contrast to jurisdictions that limit arbitration's role or maintain stricter guidelines for disciplinary appeals. Where appellate processes are streamlined and less subject to discretionary interpretation, outcomes tend to be more predictable, which can foster a greater sense of fairness for both officers and the public. Thus, a noteworthy trend emerges. The manner in which POBR frameworks integrate arbitration and appeals mechanisms can significantly affect whether accountability measures are perceived as coherent, equitable, and credible. Another important comparative dimension pertains to the speed and thoroughness of investigations. States that impose short deadlines or rigid procedural milestones for concluding inquiries, often justified as promoting fairness and preventing indefinite investigations, may inadvertently hamper the pursuit of comprehensive evidence collection. Critics argue that these constraints create conditions under which investigators feel compelled to finalize cases prematurely, potentially missing crucial evidence, or failing to fully develop witness testimony. Conversely, states that afford investigators more flexibility in timing may achieve more complete and reliable fact-finding processes, albeit at the risk of prolonging disciplinary uncertainty. This tension suggests trend. States are grappling with how best to balance efficiency with thoroughness, and outcomes vary based on how that balance is struck. Furthermore, the comparative analysis reveals differences in how POBR statutes interact with broader police reforms. Where strong public demand for accountability aligns with legislative willingness to revisit POBR statutes, as seen in recent reforms in Maryland, incremental adjustments tend to enhance transparency and streamline disciplinary procedures. In states less inclined toward reform, POBR laws remain largely static, perpetuating long-standing concerns about opaque proceedings and the difficulty of removing officers accused of serious misconduct. This discrepancy highlights an emerging trend of divergence. Some jurisdictions are embracing incremental reform as a means of responding to shifting public expectations, while others hold fast to the status quo, potentially intensifying calls for federal-level guidance or more sweeping legislative overhauls. A final notable trend emerges in how POBR outcomes affect community police relations. In states where confidentiality is being relaxed and where disciplinary records are increasingly accessible, community stakeholders often report improved trust and willingness to engage in dialogue with police departments. By contrast, in locales where the public perceives that POBR protections shield officers excessively, mistrust and cynicism can deepen, straining the already fragile bonds between law enforcement and the communities they serve. This correlation between POBR-driven outcomes and community sentiment suggests that statutory frameworks are not merely technical instruments. They carry symbolic weight that influences the broader public perception of legitimacy in policing. Taken together, these comparative outcomes and trends reveal that while POBR frameworks stem from a common objective, ensuring procedural fairness for officers, their impacts diverge widely based on localized policy decisions, legislative cultures, and shifting societal attitudes. Trends in transparency, consistency, investigative thoroughness, and community trust all hinge on how states adapt and amend their statutes over time. As this evolution continues, the interplay of public pressure, political will, and advocacy from civil rights groups and police unions will likely shape the direction of POBR statutes, potentially encouraging a slow but steady convergence toward more balanced frameworks. Ultimately, recognizing these comparative trends helps illuminate the complexities of policymaking in this domain and underscores the importance of evidence-based adjustments that aspire to protect officers' rights without sacrificing the essential aims of accountability, justice, and public confidence in law enforcement.